for something. I know that you're used to coming into online talks and being able to do your laundry and cook your breakfast and, vacuum the floor. And I'm going to ask you for your full presence to really come be with us, to be online, to like really to be fully online and to bring us your face and your body language because stories are made by those who catch them and who receive them. And this is a collaborative experience that we're going to be in. I said experiments, I would almost say experiment because I always feel like it's an experiment with Stephen Jenkinson, who is, gosh, our honored guest. And I could tell you all about how he's a philosopher, an educator. Now I consider like a rock star poet on the road, helping us find our ways to face death while learning how to truly live. That's been my experience in receiving so much of what he is. But you guys have all probably all read about that, and I want to tell you a little secret. Maybe it's not such a big secret, and I don't even know how much Stephen knows this, so I'm going to tell you. He's. I was trying to figure out. I was like, are you the grandfather, the godfather, the uncle for the School for Sacred Storytelling? But it was really truly getting to sit with him at his school in Canada and to really be with someone who holds story and language and words with such tenacity and with such ferocity and with such care and consideration that it gave me the courage to do something as insane as saying that I could even begin to host a space where storytelling could consider to be alive in a way in our times. And so I really want to honor Stephen for the way that he is and the way that he continues to be so generous with those who come to sit with him and to learn with him. And one of the things that he really gifted me as one of those people that likes to do everything right. I really loved being that perfect little student there. And he taught me the distinction between killing something, really truly murdering it by trying to answer a question or be so clever, and what it is to be so humble as to really wonder and to wonder together. And what miracles and mysteries can come alive in that space. So, without further ado, we're going to get to do some wondering with Stephen, and please feel free to wonder among us and with us. And so, place your questions as you have them into our chat box, and I'll be keeping an eye on that space. And Stephen, I know that you are on the road. You are meeting us from Colorado at the end of this first leg of the tour. And when I last saw you, you were actually in LA, but this was pre-COVID times touring around. And I mean, let's just start with how are you? Where are like how is that heart of yours? And also, what are you noticing? What has changed in the world since I don't even know what to call it, but before then and after then and yeah, what are you noticing?
Thank you for asking. I'm here, but I'm not entirely clear on how I'm doing. And it has nothing to do with not being okay. It's just, the panopticon of that one is alleged to achieve about one's own state of mind is really overrated, I think. So I just finished last show last night, so I'm in a little bit of the backwash of that certain kind of very transient glory. I think that's a good word for it. The people were really rapturous and weren't just simply glad to get out. I mean, nothing of that applies to anything that I think I've ever done. I'm just nobody's idea of a night out. I think that's fair to say. Even if I have musical accompaniment, full band, and the whole thing, I think it's I think people drag each other, honestly, or offer incentives or something. But once we're there, I mean, it's over to me, and I'm sitting here in a godless hotel. I don't know if there's another kind, but this one is particularly bereft of divinity, I think. And it's right beside a monstrous highway just here. And there's a booming air conditioning system over here. And it's a perfect way to come down after the glories of people admiring what you're capable of. By the time I get home, I'll be nobody again. But what have I seen though? Um, well, it's an immense, what would I call it? A privilege of a kind to be welcomed, first of all, into another country. And maybe welcome is too strong, but at the very least, allowed in. That happened, it feels like about 2 weeks ago, but I've lost track. And then the privilege of losing track of time, where so many people, and in my own ordinary life, I have the same obligation to track things, to not be too disoriented as to place in time, so I can answer the bell and do the things expected of me and all of that. But this life, your day peaks when everyone else's day is diminishing, and it's an awkward responsibility to have, but there's a lot of joy in it, I have to say. But the joy isn't canceled by what I'm about to acknowledge with you. Far from it. It's actually a kind of, there's a gem, and then there's the seating for the gem, the kind of housing, whatever you call it, of a ring. This is the housing of the ring of the remarkable outings we've had over the last 10 days or so. I didn't really know. I could have guessed what the cumulative circumstance of the last 30 months could be, depending on where you're talking about and whom. I mean, I've had people say nothing appreciable has changed in the last 30 months in their little corner of the world. It's cushioned, as apparently that makes it out to be. I find that so stark and so hard to credit, but that they're quite convinced that that's true. And then there are people for whom nothing has changed because the disasters of their pre-COVID life are recognizable in the disasters of the COVID life, you see. Now the fan's just gone off on my computer, if anybody's hearing that, there's absolutely nothing I can do about it. It's just part of the technology of being on the road. And the computer is tired. It's been out with us for a couple of weeks, and even though I only turn it on at night, it's obviously not happy. And I don't know if it yearns to go home or whatever it is, but there you go. So the show that we crafted is called the Rough Gods Tour, this tour of the fall of 2022. And it's a very well-named time. The name comes from the record that we crafted in the midst of the pandemic, or at the very beginning, actually, when we didn't know there was a pandemic going on. Not we collectively, literally, Gregory Hoskins and myself were holed up in an adobe hut in a down in Oaxaca somewhere, at night. But we had no idea while we were crafting this record what was happening in the world. And when we turned the radio on 10 or 12 days into the episode, we found out what was happening to the rest of you. That was our first indication. There's a lot of casualties. I don't think the casualty list has even begun to be assembled, to be honest. I can see a kind of dissociative state, maybe I could call it this. It's nothing to do with, keeping safe distance from people, so-called, and those little footprints, on all the floorings and all the places that you go, telling you what 6 feet looks like and all that sort of thing. I'm talking about a kind of involuntary, unacknowledged distance making apparatus that people are engaged in it in order to cope with the certain degree of collapse that's begun to introduce itself into their lives. And the collapse I'm thinking of has to do with the sense that certain things were possible. I don't know if this is accurate, but it seems true though, that certain things were possible just a scant few years ago that are never likely to be seen possible again. And these things really weigh on people. And when there's not a kind of life of enhanced necessity, a kind of life-loving necessity that accrues to your days, which as farming people, we on my end of the stick, we have good fortune in that regard. But if you don't have that, you have to invent necessity as you go in a time where necessity has basically found the exit door and seems nowhere to be found. So is this true more in an urban setting? I suspect it might be. I don't know for sure. But Denver's looks pretty rough from an outsider's point of view. But Boulder didn't look any less rough, even though it's an enhanced kind of lostness maybe that accrues to the place, and all down the line. So we've been storied and privileged witnesses to the what seems to be the barely acknowledged rancor and dishevelment of the last 30 months. And I know this is a longer answer than anybody was counting on, but if you ever ask me how I'm doing, if you're not prepared for a longer answer, there's an easier question to ask than that. So I would just end off by saying, you know, I was lucky enough to come up with a book early on in this proceedings, and it's called A Generation's Worth, and the subtitle, I think, is Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns. I think that's it. And the last 2 pages were devoted, now this is 2.5, 3 years ago, to an anticipation of what the outcome would be when this fails to pass, when the plague fails to become history, which is what I suspect will be the case. That the quiet collateral damage will only begin to appear when the all clear signal is sounded. And that's where we're begin to find out what the things that we agreed to and the choices that we made actually look like in their consequence, not their intent, in their consequence. So I think it's a grave time, to be honest. And you know, apropos of your very kind introduction, the requirements of story hearing, not entertainment, but story hearing, are heavily upon us now. The Nights of Grief and Mystery performances that we've been doing are very much children of their times, in the sense that I'm utterly unwilling to collude with the notion that normal, quote unquote normal, is something worthy of us getting back to. Everything I can hear about it suggests to me that people who are longing after normal are longing after 2019. Now, I remember 2019, and I'm sure some people on this call remember it too. And 2019 could never be confused with the high water mark of any kind of cultural or poetic or mythic achievement. 2019 was as banal and as irresponsible a time period as I've ever lived through in my lifetime. And the notion that this represents something to get back to is it's almost, it borders on the unthinkable, but not the unimaginable, sadly. So I think I'm in the very early days, as I think maybe we are, but I've been lucky enough to be a witness to it over the last, well, we toured in the UK too, so over the last month, I would say, that that the willingness to turn the page seems to tear the page out instead.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, it definitely feels like we've arrived, as is the saw of our neighbor. That's amazing timing that the second I take off the mic, that begins. But anyway, we're here with everything happening at once. Um, we are, just so you know, you're sitting with a wild group of people coming from so many different places. You know, some of us have been in the School for Sacred Storytelling for almost a year. Some are just in this one class where we're playing with, you know, I'm coming from California, pardon me. We're playing in the heart chakra, matters of the heart, and we're wondering about this idea of unity, and we've definitely been courting it. And then there's a lot of people that just came to be with you today. that have nothing to do with the school, but we're called to be with you. So just noting the conglomeration that calls us together. But before we can get into matrimony, because I know that that is what people are drawn to today, it's like, what does it mean to carry a story? What is it to be a storied race in these times? Um, we were just talking, we were just talking about what it is to be in LA or in the States and be seeing, you know, nothing seems comfortable anymore. The hotels don't have the basic things that they used to have. My streets are covered with homeless people, and like what it is to be a human walking past that every day, like what it takes to actually like walk past that day after day and to stay connected to our humanity. And so I'm curious to wonder with you about like how does story connect us to our humanity and give us bring us to the threshold of really being alive in these times.
Well, I don't think it necessarily does. I don't think it's a magic carpet. I don't think and it properly shouldn't be a kind of beam me up Scotty solution to the ordinary grind. In my humble estimation, as a sometime practitioner of what you're describing, I think we have an obligation to stories much more than to be their beneficiaries, to get our yayas out in their presence, you know, to take it to be some kind of safe, oh man, that word now, some kind of safe place that you can quote unquote be yourself, as if being yourself is the greatest measure of what's entrusted to you. You see, so that's the first. In terms of the way the question was crafted, I don't think it's a given at all that stories simply by appearing or being spoken, that anything necessarily happens at all. So there's, as you properly acknowledged earlier on, there's some skill in the telling, hopefully. Not always, but hopefully there is. And hopefully the skillfulness is not a matter of the soft sell. Hopefully the skillfulness has more to do with authenticity and a genuine acknowledgement of the privilege of the gift of the tongue. But it needs a partner, and the story's not the partner. The story's riding you as you might ride a horse, but hopefully with more skill and perhaps less less tolerance than you might have had when you were the rider. But it rides you properly so, and it employs you without really securing your permission if you have this kind of skillfulness. But it has to be met with an equal and abundant skill. That's the skill of story hearing or listening or attending to or abiding with. The notion that stories, well, maybe I should say it better this way. You might imagine, there's no reason for you to know this, but I can tell you that 30 months into this pandemic, I have submitted myself to a regime of interrogation known as interviews. Illogically, almost. I mean, there's been so many of them, and it's hard to defend. And it's an enormously seductive arrangement if you don't bring a certain degree of maturity and personal failure to the enterprise, because there's a kind of lofting, if you will. There's a kind of updraft that gathers underneath the skirts of your life, so to speak, and just blows them wide open, and suddenly anything seems possible, and you sound, reasonably cogent, and there's a lot of backslapping and me tooing going on, and collusion of various kinds, even though it's clear the evidence just outside your door doesn't warrant that sense of very easygoing well-being that seems to come with it. So often what ensues in these things is a kind of co-opting pseudo agreement that's really another kind of argument. And this is why I'm bringing up the word argument now, because I remember when I was very young, I still seem to have some nascent ability to speak. And routinely I was given career advice all across the board. And it was always the same career. You should be a lawyer, they said. As if anybody with the capacity for speaking, that's obviously where they go. And then from there to politics, apparently, and there to to Graceland. I don't know. But I resisted I was never a strong impulse. But the notion was apparently that if words came to you, then the purpose of them coming to you was to turn around and make them do your bidding and send them out into the world to convince other peoples of your points of view or whatever it is. That's the argumentation. The amazing thing about argument seems to me to be this. I've stood in front of, well, you know, as you know, you and a lot of people in the school over 12 or so years, and the circumstance would appear to be built for argumentation, persuasion, dissuasion, and the rest. And certainly that can be there. But you have to contend with it. And you have to ask yourself whether or not any capacity you have with the language is there to oblige people to come around to your understanding. When people try to, in the early days, I was as, possessed of this nonsense as anybody could be. I thought that was my responsibility to people, is to clarify, quote, myself. I'm embarrassed to acknowledge it, but it was a beginner's mistake. The amazing thing about anybody who was trying to reproduce the cases that I was making in the early days of the school, they routinely couldn't do it. Not because I was so skillful, not because they weren't. It's because of the nature of argument. Here's the amazing thing about it. When you're subjected to argument and diatribe and consternation of all kinds, and who hasn't been over the last while, then you find that when you try to enter into the argument for the sake of reproducing it for somebody who wasn't there, you can't find your way. In other words, the argument doesn't reproduce itself. It's not on kind of speed dial, if you will. Why not? Well, it's not very user-friendly, actually, on the one side. And on the other side, I don't think the human mind is actually built argumentatively. And I think that's one of the signs. You can't reproduce the argument, even though you may remember what was being argued about, but still you can't follow it. You can't trace it. It has tributaries that are utterly lost to you. But if you try to do the same thing with a story, the stunning thing about doing so is no matter where you enter the story, no matter how half-assed your recollection is, if you do so with some fidelity, not accuracy, just fidelity, what will begin to happen is the kind of salient features of the story begin to reassemble around your good intention in this regard. And when they do, they start to coalesce. And before you know it, the story is telling itself, maybe fitfully, maybe elliptically, maybe not linearly as you thought it was, but it's beginning to reassemble itself draped across your good intention, right? Which argument can never do. And I've come to understand that this is because the human, I don't know, let's call it mind for now, that the human mind is a storied thing in and of itself. And it recognizes its kin when it's in the presence of storiness. When it's in the presence of argument, the storied one in you just goes for a walk, just nowhere to be found. And it's out in the alley with the story, swapping lies to each other, while the talking heads are in the conference room making trouble for everybody.
Thank you. I so appreciate what you're speaking to, especially around the um, the willingness to come forth and just be with a story, and that it's this meeting of this collaboration of different energies of will, intention, and I don't think you used the word spirit, but my interpretation was, and then the spirit of a story, and I the energy that lives through it, and I think we could go for a mile on that one, but I also know that people came here to talk about matrimony, and
Well,
I didn't
I
know what I was
understand,
getting
and you
myself
want
in.
to, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I was
But
just going to say, we are. I know the word hasn't come up yet, But sometimes you don't have to talk about the thing. You can talk in its presence and the thing begins to gather. So I've been speaking matrimonially, not about matrimony. So there's no frustration, at least not yet.
Oh, good.
So please go ahead.
Well, um, I'll confess that I got myself into, I didn't realize what I was getting myself into by inviting you to speak on matrimony, because I was still living in this old idea of that matrimony was marriage. And then I started listening to what you were saying because I thought, oh, unity, love, marriage, it's all in there, relationship. So before I even go on with my next question, I really feel like matrimony. What what is this matrimony that you speak of? And how does it live among us in these times?
Well, it came to me in a clutch of other words, to be honest, as a distinct thing that was claiming my attention. The other words were ceremony, patrimony, those two, along with matrimony, not alimony. That's along the lines of what you were talking about a second ago. But the other ones for sure. And it announced itself in a very, um, excuse the language, a shit disturbing fashion along the lines of this. I don't attend weddings. I think it's better for everybody if I don't. I'm invited from time to time, but I don't take up the offer or the gauntlet, which is what it would be for me. But I was reflecting on whether or not, as people were being invited off the top to enter into an understanding that they were about to witness two people conjuring by their willingness this mystery train. I know nobody says it this way, but this mystery train called matrimony that apparently happens without anybody really noticing it or maybe even meaning for it to happen. It happens. That's what the ceremony allegedly supposed to be. So I'm, in an age of that's absolutely punch drunk on inclusivity. Here's something I've never heard. I've heard matrimony said and said and said again in this context. Never once have I heard the word patrimony as some kind of parallel universe or some kind of equal but distinct presence or some mandatory presence or even some worthy presence. It's never come in for mention in the context of matrimony. But if you say it out loud, you recognize a certain kind of kinship, surely, that just the construct of the words themselves suggest that once upon a time they knew each other rather well. Not so much anymore, it would appear, and much the worse for ceremony, I would say, by virtue of that alienation. So that's kind of how it started. I just thought to myself, why is nobody ever invited into the holy state of patrimony? And I don't have to tell anybody who's listening. There's one reason that's quite clear why not, because the word holy and any word that begins with patr or er, you'll never find them together in this age. Not for the balance of my lifetime, I don't believe. Will there be any kind of acknowledgement of the distinct possibility of the kinship of those two things, that is holiness or sacredness, and anything that has patra in the word? So that's a very sad state of affairs. That kind of apartheid, like all apartheids, really doesn't mean anybody any good. Although it satisfies a lot of grievance, and some of it's understandable. But so what? The consequences are vast, uncharted, mostly unintended, and fairly dire, it seems already. So maybe a couple of words without turning this into any kind of diatribe at all, or maybe it's too late for that, about matrimony. Well, the first part, let's talk about the second part of the word first, because that's the one that appears in the other words as well. The mony suffix suggests something that's rather banal and uneventful. It means something in the order of, by these particular indicators, you can track the way of this thing. That's what that means. In other words, whatever precedes the word moni, the moni is telling you you're getting a taste of the incarnation of this enterprise. And there's a certain set of behaviors and things that you could trace and track as if you were in the forest and you were trying to find something that was out ahead of you that was making a trail as it goes, something in that order. And then the root word of matrimony has nothing to do with the associations that you just riffed on, nothing at all. This is quite fascinating, really. It's not a synonym for romance. It's not a synonym for sexual attraction. It's not a synonym for shacking up. It's not a synonym for anything, really. The root word is mother. Mother. Not woman, but obviously imbued with a gendered understanding of things. So if we put the word back together, then matrimony has the suggestion that it's an articulation of a repertoire, of a psychic and emotional and a mythic and poetic repertoire. And the repertoire has a purpose, and it's not self-expression. The purpose is mothering. So the root word is not mother as a personal identity, not even secondarily as a particularly or exclusively gendered thing. The word actually is a function, first and foremost, and not an identity at all. So it's something that is done. So it's a kind of scheme, if you will, for mothering. That's what matrimony is supposed to be. Holy smokes. It seems like there's a lot of people left out of the arrangement. And doesn't it seem a little, at least from a contemporary, a traditional point of view, a little the cart before the horse? How can you talk about mothering, which is in the word, in a circumstance that's supposed to, in a traditional sense of the term, precede mothering? In other words, you get hitched first, and then maybe that ensues. So why does the mother come first in matrimony when it was supposed to be a preamble to mothering? And very often it was. Well, because the understanding here is that matrimony is not entered into for the sake of personal fulfillment. That's why. 2, it doesn't exist as a vessel for your secret or adamant feelings about another person. My God, what could possibly be left? What could it be if you cross those 2 things off the list? Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that those things don't belong, but then we would call it something else, like, for example, romance. But everybody recognizes instantly that the word romance simply doesn't carry the same cultural freight as the word matrimony does. No matter how you feel about it, but you can recognize your associations. They don't run so very, very deep. You could say romance associations are lateral or collateral, but matrimonial associations are kind of axial, if you will, that a number of other things rotate around. If that's true, and this is me wondering about this out loud for the first time in many, many months, so I'm leaving a lot of things out, I'm sure. If you revisit matrimony, what do you end up with? That it's a cultural event that employs the feelings that 2 people have for each other to appear. That's what it does. It relies on these things, requires them, but doesn't guarantee them. And over the longer haul, finds them as much getting in the way as helpful. That is the feelings the 2 people have with each other. And the reason I mention is because, as anybody knows, the feelings we have for each other, they obey this kind of ellipse. Of course they do. So matrimony can't possibly, as a cultural institution, and I haven't said its function yet, but I'm about to do that now, But as a cultural institution, matrimony can't possibly not reliably depend on the feelings two people have for each other. It would be a ramshackling proposition out of the gate. And the more we have de-traditionalized matrimony, the more it's devolved to an assemblage of feelings that people have for each other, first and foremost. And I leave it to the people listening to decide whether or not that's been a good thing, either in their lives or in the lives of the people around them or in the culture that they claim affinity with. So what might it be then? And to talk about matrimony, I'm going to talk about patrimony first here, to give a sense of what something isn't and help it appear that way. The word patrimony, I mean, I virtually never hear it. The only time you ever hear it with any consistency is if you're in university and if you've made the questionable career choice of going into anthropology or sociology, you'll hear the word. It's a very technical term in those fields. And it generally is used to refer to, let's see if I have any examples of it around me. I don't really. Cultural patrimony basically is synonymous with the material culture that's produced by a given people. That's what the word patrimony is typically associated with. So on the surface of it, if you're talking about pots and tools and things of this kind, that's the level I'm talking about. You think to yourself, well, it's a rather uninspiring compared to matrimony. If that's what patrimony is, rather uninspiring. It doesn't seem to carry anything close to the mandate that matrimony does. And I'd agree with you, on the surface, that's the way it seems. But if you let it in a little farther, maybe it suggests to you something like this. The fabricating of cultural patrimony is two things. It provides the culture or the people with the necessities of life. So it's provisionary. The other thing it does is it invests the activity with a sense of a remembered sense of neededness or necessity. I suppose that's a good word. So whoever engages in producing patrimony is engaged in the non-symbolic act of providing. If you will, the provider gene is palpable and present in the undertaking. Now, what I'm going to say next is going to sound, and I'm going to stop in a second, because there's probably another question here somewhere. What I'm about to say, I'm going to sound very cavemanish. And well, I guess that's the era I'm talking about, so it would probably fit. And I'm going to arbitrarily divide certain number of cultural functions for the sake of expressing the idea, okay? I know there's a lot of gray area in what I'm about to say. Of course there is. But it's just a story we're telling here. It's not an argument. So maybe it goes like this. There was a time, and it's not clear that the time has passed, when any woman who was willing to submit to the rigors of matrimony, not the romance, the mothering, by virtue of getting pregnant and going through it and bringing it to term and all of that, was submitting herself to a certain layer of vulnerability or worse. And you can imagine back in the day, I mean, I'm going back thousands and thousands of years now, that the incidence of death and childbirth and so on would have been remarkably high for all people involved. And so it would have been, I'm sure it would have been understood as a kind of extraordinary feat, which was not all powerful, which was very vulnerability making as well. And I'm sure if that was true and people were not entirely clear on the relationship between copulation and procreation, then you can imagine the numinous quality that would have gathered itself around those women who had become pregnant and ultimately bore children and so on. And I'm not sure that's worn off. even though we claim to understand things otherwise. Perhaps the numinous quality is proper and belongs and is still there. Wouldn't that be something if it was so? And we don't make war on that particular mystery with information. So if that's true, and if a woman's willing to do this, and the, you know, the cultural wisdom of the place would certainly inform her and the people around her as to these subtle variables and troubles and torments that could ensue. Certain things, they say, had to be in place first in order for that susceptibility to come into the world. In other words, as her ability to participate as actively as she once did in the life of the culture begins to diminish as a consequence of the third trimester coming on and so forth, then the necessity of people to take over around her would have been that much more palpable, it seems to me. And the necessities and needs of life would not be provided by her, because she's providing a different kind of necessity of life now. So this has to come from elsewhere. And the elsewhere seems to be connected in some fashion to this provider gene that I mentioned a minute ago. So as it would appear, much of human history would have included perhaps the following: that for a woman to enter into the deal with life called matrimony, some patrimony was necessary as a precursor, as a placemaker, as a home maker for that willingness, that matrimonial willingness. And that's the link, I think, to the sociology and the anthropology understanding of culture, of patrimonial material culture. Because it would appear that it might have been more often than not the fathering job to make a place where the mothering could ensue, the willingness to mother could ensue and be honored, given its place, and given some protection from the slings and arrows of their particular fortunes of the times. These things, it seems to me, are vaguely traceable still to this day in the kind of brailing that goes on in the 15-minute matrimonial event. It's still mysteriously kind of there. The thing I'm thinking of right now is, so if there's a traditional procession down the middle of the church hall or wherever it is in the field, and she's going somewhere with her retinue and so forth, there's somebody waiting for her. This is the usual choreography. There's somebody, and you know who the somebody is, attended by certain of his confreres and so forth. He's there first. I don't know if you've ever wondered why. Why don't they just come from, theatrically from the wings, both, and meet in the middle somehow? But they don't. More often than not, it's this old arrangement that somehow the groom, if you will, is there first and is in some fashion staking a claim to this particular ground, or holding it together, or in some fashion providing the patrimonial function, the place for her to appear and her willingness to do so, to appear. There's much more to say about it, but that's a beginning.
Thank you so much. And this, you're beginning to touch on this, the architecture of ritual and ceremony, and its continued arrangement in our lives, with or without our consent or even awareness of it. It's like it's still found a way to exist. I just want to mention again that if anyone has questions, please place them in our chat box. We're not going to do the normal Q&A at the end. Your questions can emerge through, so that's the way to bring them to us, this conversation. The piece that I'm reckoning with, as you speak, and as I was listening to more and more about matrimony and this piece around it, it creates a place for mothering. And even as we were speaking before about how much the world has changed and how much is being shattered and broken apart. And you were even talking about the family systems. I remember in your recording, you were talking about how isolated family systems are now, and how raising children is just not it's not designed to be done just in an isolated family, but in community. And so this greater yearning that I feel like is alive in us is this place for mothering. And I began to wonder as you were speaking, like, matrimony must really want to be with us if it's coming and knocking at your door, forcing upon you this time to really sit and wonder with it and with us. It's like this presence wants to be here. And yet I went and looked up the statistics, and like in 1970, 27% of women were single, and now 48% of women, I assume also men, are unmarried. And yet this need and a place for mothering doesn't go away. And so I'm wondering about, how does matrimony continue to live among us and with us without the ceremony, without the ritual?
Okay. I have to excuse myself for a second because housekeeping's at the door. It's always, I'll be right back. Speaking of mothering, I'll be right back.
It could have been that moment when your question drives somebody away. Um, Please do bring in your questions, and I'm seeing some people put them in private messages, but you can also put them in public. I know it's a thing to wonder out loud, but your wondering inspires other people's wondering. So please feel free to make them public. I'm just seeing different pieces come up, but I'm going to read them out loud for us. Kristen, I hope it's okay if I read yours out loud. Oh, well, Stephen's back, so I'll pop in.
Okay. Sorry. Life.
Happens.
Um, yeah, it does happen, thank God. So I would like to introduce, like I said, many things I left out in the overture there. And here's one of them, which I think really belongs as a preamble to a response to what you've asked. Now, it would be fairly easy and easy to expect that when people hear the word mothering, they must imagine children, and they must imagine the birthing process, and then they must imagine the overhaul to the personal identity of the woman in question, and then and on and on and on it goes, you see, at the procreative level. But I would come back, I would ask us all to reimagine mothering as something that's not, it's not tied to children, at least not the bearing, the making and the bearing of children. That the word mothering in the context that I'm using it now would have been for the longest time, and in many places still is, understood fundamentally not as a procreative act, but as a nurturative cultural act. So the mothers were principally mothers of the culture, whether or not they themselves had personally produced children is secondary to the understanding. So you could say all children are mothered, but not all mothers have children. Or you could say it this way, understood this in this fashion. Kids have more than one mother. Hence, you have the notion of it takes a village and so on. So now, because of the interruption, I'm having a bit of a hard time remembering your question. Could you remind me, please?
We're speaking about, how does the role of matrimony continue to live among us, assuming that it wants to and yearns to, without the ritual and ceremony that calls it into being of merit through marriage.
Yeah, very good. Well, I'm on my better days, I'm an animist, but I wouldn't know how to corroborate the characterization in the question that says matrimony wants anything in particular, never mind wants to be with us like we're such a great idea. And that, like, matrimony's got nothing else to do except wanting to be with us, as the numbers indicate with greater and greater uh, kind of lethal clarity, that the disinclination when it comes to matrimony is not incidental and it's not temporary. It's a cardinal feature of the dominant culture of Anglo North America. Not only that, but the retreating from or the turning away from matrimony is, I don't have to tell anybody this, is deemed to be a brave new world act to take, that it's coming to your senses and so forth. So, you know, the answer to your question needs to be carried on in the presence of the understanding that turning away from matrimony is not because nobody knows what to do about it. It's because it's been basically flung on the slag heap of dominant culture's mania for self-determination and the utter unwillingness to submit oneself to something that's larger in every conceivable way than the self is. And I can tell you, it's no surprise, I don't think, to most people listening. I worked in the death trade for a considerable period of time. And I was disabused of a lot of untested understandings of life during my time there. And one of them was this, that it's your death. Now, I know this is not supposed to be the singular focus of this session today, but death does belong in a discussion about matrimony. So the amazing thing that I saw over and over again in all the bad deaths that I saw, which were the vast majority of them were bad by any sane measure, was that, and they often had this singular feature in common, that the dying and therefore the death was personalized, interiorized, and privatized. That should sound familiar. That should sound like that may be a contributing factor to this statistic that you just mentioned, right? Because ask yourself ancestrally, those of you who have ancestry going back several hundred years off this continent, do you think your people's people came to this continent in order for you to be able to submit to anything in particular? You know what the creation story of the place is. The Anglo American creation story is freedom, isn't it? Freedom. And freedom was freedom from, not freedom for. It was informed by the medieval, miseries that people were trying to escape from. Not very successfully, I might add, because most of them were recreated here on this side of the pond. So there's a certain degree of tragedy that ensued in all this dying, because people came to it as something that they had a right to exercise dominion over. And the savage truth of the matter is, excuse the language again, but death couldn't give a shit about your belief system. I promise you this is true. I promise you that dying is a divinity who's utterly underpersuaded by your prejudices. So when you come to your dying time as someone beset by conviction, the last thing you're likely to do is learn about dying. If you do at all, you learn how to resist it, how to thwart it, how to defend yourself against it, and therefore how to prolong it unnecessarily, unnaturally, maniacally, and in a very damaging fashion. What's the parallel? Why are you talking about dying now? Well, aside from the fact that it's fairly close to my heart still to this day, and aside from the fact that I see nothing changed in all the time since I was there, it's also this mania for self-determination is one of the things that's impoverishing us so thoroughly. And it's creating a kind of unthinking prejudice when it comes to anything that's inherited, anything that's not self-generated, self-made, and absolutely bearing no fingerprints whatsoever except one's own fingerprints. The holy terrain called the self, all of that thing. So it's not surprising in a place that glorifies self-determination and dominion and all those attending sovereignty and whatever else is going today. It's not surprising that such a place would experience tremendous difficulties in the basic integrating functions of the culture, where people's fundamental relationship to each other was one of mutual obligation, not negotiating limits on the obligation, but trying to find a way to really actualize it and really make it happen, which is what matrimony and patrimony were. They were mutually integrated functions that the culture appeared in the midst of. And when one of these things or both of them becomes, the failure to corroborate ensues, and subsequently a kind of corruption of their function begins, and a terrible PR firm working for them, to the point where these things are deemed to be prisons, prisons for the pristine self, prisons that are imposed upon the otherwise sovereign self, that kind of thing. Well, who would find submission anything other than another kind of tyranny? But if matrimony is not how you feel about another person, one, and if matrimony doesn't happen because you like somebody, or because you move in with them, or you share a closet with them, or you share your body with them, if matrimony is finally understood again as a particular kind of alchemical event that has to be undertaken and performed and achieved, then you go back to the utter ceremonial, I was going to say ineptness, but then maybe that's not close, that's not strong enough. The ceremonial illiteracy of a time like this one. You'd reasonably expect that the culture would suffer because the matrimony suffers and the patrimony too. So I'm not sure it wants in, and for good reason.
Thank you.
Welcome. Imagine getting, based on all this, asking me to do your wedding. This is crazy, but I've been asked to do it many times. But maybe we can get into that if you want to ask.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I've heard stories. I've never seen photos, but I've
So have I.
but the stories have lingered about. So perhaps you can bring us there. You know what is your approach to matrimony in these days? And when someone comes to you and asks you to walk them across that threshold and walk with them into that realm, how do you do that?
Oh, now I say no. Okay, could you say a little more? Yes, I can say a little more. But I promise you that the no, it comes from a compassionate place.
Yeah.
Okay,
Maybe I should ask you
so
why you have come to say
so
no,
here's,
or how have you done it? Yeah. How I mean, I have heard these incredible stories about these 2-day ceremonies, and I don't even
okay,
want
sorry,
to.
something just froze in the transmission. Okay, we're having a bit of a problem with the link or something here because you froze and I didn't hear most of what you said. I'm sorry.
Oh, it's okay. It's 6 planets in retrograde, I think. We're lucky to be in communion. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, this, I mean, perhaps what were the experiences that led you to the wisdom of where you're living now, which is your answer is no. But also, I was wondering if there's a story that wants to emerge, because I know that you have walked several people with great consideration to this threshold, and um, perhaps what was it that you learned in those places of what is how do you invite the spirit of matrimony how do you invite matrimony, how do you court matrimony in a good way?
Okay. This is now too much of a question. but
Okay.
I'll have to break it up a bit. So let me
Okay.
start with the first thing you asked. It's hurt that got me here. And of course, there's wisdom in hurt, yes, if you're willing to learn it. But there was so much hurt that ensued that families visited upon the people they claimed to love in these situations that I was asked to preside over, that I couldn't, in good conscience, do it one more time. That's the short answer. And that should be an arresting answer for anybody who's listening. I'm saying it very provocatively because I was there and I got no reason to misrepresent or exaggerate the level of hurt that was perpetrated in these moments. So, why though? Why do people do this to each other? Well, you see, you would imagine that people are exercising their alternativeness if they come to me, a non-ordained person, and ask me to preside non-legally over the proceedings. You would think that they are operating outside the confines, outside the box, etc. All that outsider status, and and this would surely mean that all the paganry is giving its full reign, and the real thing is happening. Some version of that. But matrimony is a very conservative proposition. Small c, maybe that's not the best chosen word for the description I'm giving, but it does conserve. That's what it does. It remembers the fundament of the culture and proceeds accordingly. That's one of the things it's doing. That's what the mothering of this kind of, at the cultural level, does, the fathering as well. So then, this means, it seems to me, that every time the trappings of matrimony come out of the closet, come out of the boxes and so forth, there is some degree of animation and the people who attend, that they, I won't say understand, but they're visited by the things I've been talking about here, not in a kind of concerted, consistent, conscious way, but it's there. Okay, so this is to say then that if we proceed otherwise, and it's just a very old thing that I used to do, it's just very old in the culture, and so nobody remembers it anymore. And so the characteristic wedding is 15 or 20 minutes long, right? So to make sure nothing happens is how I would say it. You mean nothing goes wrong? No, I mean exactly what I said, that these 15 or 20-minute weddings are there to make sure that matrimony doesn't take place, you see, because matrimony is that remarkable overhaul of the psyche. And if your psyche happens to be crafted in a me first culture, then you're in trouble in a matrimonial circumstance. And you're going to have to recast it until it turns into an event of personal expression, primarily or exclusively. And if you're intent on doing that, you'd never ask me to do it. So I know this is a long answer, but these are very big questions. So what would happen? I'm going to generalize now across all the events. What would happen is people's fundamental expectation, the kind of, if I could use a term from your culture here, the inner Republican that lives around these things. Nobody imagined or credited themselves with having such a presence. But when it comes to conservative and conserving social or cultural events, everybody knows what a wedding's supposed to be. Really? Where does that knowing come from? Come from all the weddings you attended before this one? Well, that's not a good guide for what a wedding's supposed to be. But you notice I'm using the word wedding here now and not matrimony, because you can get away with a wedding and have no matrimonial event whatsoever. What you have instead is that kind of concerted acknowledgement and a certain accreditation process that accrues to the feelings that two people have for each other. That's it. It's an acknowledgement of something that's already happened. That's what a wedding is. Very often, much more often than not, these people already lived together for a while. They may have kids together. So I ask you then, where's the alchemy if these events have already played themselves out, and this ceremony is coming very late in the day, if you will? I submit to you there probably isn't any. And that's the point of the short and sweet event, to make sure no matrimony messes with the situation. Because if matrimony doesn't is not principally concerned with the feelings people have with each other, but concerned with the fundament of the culture instead, then it's acknowledging the waywardness of the feelings that people have for each other. And it's doing something about their instinct to focus on the intensity of their feelings by trying to translate it into something that the culture needs. So this is all in the air, if you will. And if you mess with people's understanding that what a wedding is supposed to be is a joyful event that acknowledges the pre-existing feelings that two people have for each other, nobody's going to thank you for doing it. Nobody, for example, will ever thank you for doing the following. I think this used to be law, certainly in the jurisdiction that I live in. I'm not sure that it is anymore, but somewhere along the way, the officiant was supposed to say something like this: if there's anyone here who knows any reason why this should not proceed, speak now or forever hold your peace. You know, if this gets said, and that's a big if, it's an insider's joke. Everybody laughs nervously. Somebody cracks off about it, and the pages turn and on you go. Isn't it true? You know it's true. What's going on there? Why get through that so fast? Well, because these two people love each other and that's what it's all about. But what if that's not what it's about? And what if the acknowledgement is that there's distinct and legitimate reasons why this should not proceed? And what if those reasons belong in the ceremony instead of being boxed out because people feel positively towards each other this particular day? Oh my God. And you begin to see it's a kind of bleaching operation, I think, that goes on, a kind of strange cleansing operation to make sure that it's a kind of, emotionally speaking, that the wedding is a one-note symphony. And joy's the order of the day, with the odd tear shed for Uncle so-and-so who didn't live long enough to be there. And that's about it. But the notion of regret or longing or missed opportunity or uncertainty, it doesn't get much airplay. And I would zero in on one particular aspect of it, and then surely to God, somebody's got a question by now. I mean, besides you, Leah. And it's this. So there's an officiant, and the whole architecture of the thing is worthy of consideration too, but for the moment. So there's an officiant, a so-called master of ceremonies. Okay. And this person's nominally speaking, at the front or at the center of the event, but very temporarily, because if they're supposed to give way, aren't they? As soon as the two principal marzipan figures appear, isn't that officiant supposed to be like pocket lint, just gone? As soon as the, whatever's supposed to be said gets said. It's very fascinating. All of a sudden, these two people who have no qualifications, ceremonially speaking, suddenly become the center of the whole enterprise, and everybody falls away. I mean, that's lonely making. But that's not what I wanted to talk about. It's this. What are people doing when the two of them go up there and are obliged to say stuff out loud? More often than not, they're obliged to say stuff by rote, isn't it? Repeat after me is okay. Now, a lot of people don't do that anymore. They write their own stuff. So what do? Well, they stand at the front and they read something because they want to make sure they get it right. Wait a second. You can't remember it? Well, it's too long and I want to make sure I say it exactly. But wait a second. So anyway, you get the point I'm making. It becomes a script. And scripts are there in theater and in ceremony to make sure the gods don't appear. Okay, to box out the possibility that anything could go sideways. It predetermined stuff. Okay, so let me get to the thing I'm trying to say here. What are people doing up there in the front? Now, there's a very particular kind of language that's used to describe this moment. And I don't know, I don't hear the word appear anywhere else. And it's the word vow, V-O-W. There's really not a parallel word. There's really not a synonym for that word in the English language that I can think of. And yet people will use the word promise as if it were allegedly a synonym for vow. But I've never heard anybody characterize these things as wedding promises. Why not? If the spirit of the words are fairly close together. Here's why not. When you make a promise, not at the altar, but any time in life, when are you talking about? You're making a promise to do something. You're talking about the future. That's where the promise is supposed to occur. Oh, you're making the promise now, but everything you're talking about is yet to be. So you making the promise is one thing, but nobody watches you make the promise and holds you to some particular quality that your promise making held at the time. Because it's the future we're waiting for to see whether or not you cross the T's and dot the I's and come through with the goods. So if you promise to do this and so and honor and cherish and all of that sort of thing, then one of the things you're saying is, yeah, but don't listen to me now. I mean, give me a little time, the longer term, and that's where it'll appear. So why don't they use the word promise? Because the word vow says, if you're standing here and we're in the midst of alchemically trying to do something to you, then the word vow belongs. Why? Because the difference between a vow and a promise is promise needs the future, but a vow doesn't. A vow is happening now. A vow is an incarnation of what it's declaring now. When you vow something, we watch you very carefully because it's in this moment that that's happening. It doesn't need the future. You're vowing something incarnates the thing that you're vowing. You see? And people instinctively know this at some level, which is why they stand up there with a piece of paper, or they're prompted by the officiant to say repeat after me. Because the moment is suddenly very, if you will, pregnant with possibility, and not all of them are positive. This is a crazy making moment that people are exercising some kind of dominion over by inhabiting the spirit of vow. But we don't have any education about what this means. Can you imagine, for example, somebody says to you, now, do you take so-and-so to be the, whatever it is, and do this and do that? And can you imagine the person saying, well, I'll do my best. What? You'll do your best. Okay, let's try it again. Do you, will you, etc. No, I said it before. The honest answer is this. I don't know if I'm capable of all the things you're asking me to say right now. I mean, I've never done this before, or if I have, I've never done it with this person. So in all honesty, the jury's out, isn't it? let's see what happens. But I will lead with my best intent. I hope that's good enough. The whole thing would come crashing down in a second, wouldn't it? Yeah. And now you know why. Because you're trying to get away with a promise. But a vow's a different thing. A vow absolves you of your promises. It says, go ahead and make them if you will. But we're not waiting till next week, next month, or next year. Culturally speaking, we need you to wed now. That's the preserving aspect of the alchemy. We need people who are bound to each other. This culture requires the binding, okay? Over and above how you feel about each other. It requires the binding. Anyway, okay, what do you think?
Many things at once. Ah, thank you, thank you. We do have some questions coming in.
Okay.
And Linda is wondering about how to be raising our boys to fully participate in patrimony.
Oh my God. Yes, always the how-to questions. It's understandable, mind you, but it's not the most reliable way to come to a problem. I think a more reliable way by far is, instead of formulating how to, you change one word in the formulation and you say, how have we, not how should we? Because that's something you can talk about, which is not conjecture.
Okay.
Yeah. How have we? I'm sorry, I forgot the verb in the question. Not trained. What was it?
The question is how are we raising our boys to fully participate in patrimony?
Okay, we're not. We're not. So there's a full stop answer to the question. It's not happening. So the how to is kind of secondary, because I don't, I think, I think, oh my God, here we go. It's not clear to me that boys and young men are actually qualifying for particular kinds of attention that are not principally opprobrium. So how are young boys and young men ever going to come to an understanding of the pivotal part they play, the foundational part they're obliged to play in patrimony, when the very question of their gendered identity is bound up with shame and guilt and accusation and, diminishment and demonization and the rest? This is a real problem, and it's not going away, and it's not getting better, and it's not softening, and the pendulum is not swinging somewhere towards the middle, so these things can be re-understood in terms of the harm that's ensuing as a result of this allegedly corrective measure, you see. So of course you're going to find this in a circumstance where no young man knows how to take up the obligations and responsibilities that come with patrimony. So patrimonial work is principally undertaking the culture making work without deriving any clear, direct, or present moment benefit for it. It is, I'm not saying it's selfless, but it's provisionary. It's not acquisitive, it's provisionary. So, I mean, I can tell you, my own personal experience is not much to go by for any of you, and I'm not saying it should be, but I can tell you there are scores and scores of young men and older boys who are in touch with me routinely, basically asking me the same kind of question, but much more desperately. Okay? Because they can't find a way of life, never mind a way of making a living, that doesn't in some fashion, directly or otherwise, clearly harm the planet, or in some fashion the people around them. Right? Okay. I'm not saying that's an exclusive problem for men. I'm not. But it's certainly prevalent amongst men who've come to some kind of conscious adjudication of the possibilities over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. So, and of course, anything men's movement wise has been trivialized, has it not, at the very least, and marginalized, is it not? And it's not the center of anything in particular now. It's not that it's not understandable, but there are real consequences for it that the marginalizers may not have intended. I mean, it's a vast, vast question, but the way I'm speaking about all these things, I'm not withholding my suggesting of how these things should be otherwise. It's manifest through everything I'm saying. And so, even though the question is very distinct and discrete about a particular dilemma, I believe I've been speaking to the dilemma since we first started turning the page in this direction, maybe some 45 minutes ago, whatever it is. I don't have the checklist of do this, do this, do this, everything's going to be better. Why not? Because there's a clear campaign to discredit most of the things I'm talking about. That's why not. And everybody on this call knows that that's true. Although I don't, of course, know you at all. But if you're curious enough to be in on this call, you know what I'm saying about this. You may not see it the same way, but you do surely recognize the disastrous shaming campaign that has descended upon young men in particular. It's not clear to me that young men want to be young men. There's so little upside, there's so little merit attached to the description, and there's so little cultural employment for the undertaking. You can't reasonably expect that young men would say, yeah, being a young man, I can hardly wait.
Thank you. It's like that one's just, it dances so much at the edges of everything that you talk about, these four big, massive themes. And Joy is coming in with one of your other themes and a question around that. And she's saying part of what you bring in this kind of deep thinking about how we act or perhaps might act, but you also offer much acknowledgement that we grieve and that this kind of knowledge doesn't seem to change anything. Sorry, guys, I need to get glasses now. This is a new thing for me. Here's a question. Um, thank you. I could really use those over here. um, what do you have to say to storytellers? What do you have to say to storytellers who perhaps aspire to be elders and see little hope?
Not a lot. I think the assessment is accurate. You don't see a lot of hope. I see tons of hope. All of it, virtually all of it, doesn't work in the way that the hope mongers imagine it does. I mean, there's no sense in me replaying my hope rap here. Anybody who cares to be interested in it can find it elsewhere. Long story short, hope works like promises work. Hope's about the future. Nobody hopes for the way it is. This is a line I say in the Grief and Mystery show. Nobody hopes for the way it is. We hope for the way it isn't. So nobody hopes for now. So by definition, hope, now is beyond hopeless. It is beyond hopeless because it needs the future, and the future seems, of course, bleak. Of course it does. But, I would encourage you deeply to experiment with hope till the cows come home if you must. And then experiment with hopelessness too. Because where you find one, you generally find the other. And when you figure you've given both hope and hopelessness its due, or their due, and in good faith you've tried them both, and you have some qualification on the matter now, this is when I would finally encourage you to consider being hope-free, which is not a place in between them. It's a place without them. Okay. I don't know that storytellers, let me expand the horizon of the question a little bit, and let me speak about, I use the word artist, if I could instead. So to include more than people in the narrative arts, let's say. The principal question here is not what to do about a given thing. The principal question here is to ask, what is the job, and that's not too pedestrian a word for it, what is the job of the artist? Well, generally speaking, in a culture as destitute as this one, the answer tends to be various forms of self-expression. That's the job. Self-expression. Well, I'm going to suggest that principally artists are culture workers, not psychodynamic practitioners. Okay? So I would recast the whole consideration as follows. You've heard this many times before. I have heard it too, that artists are a mirror to the culture. And there's often a lot of aggression used to do the mirroring in terms of socially conscious art and all the rest of it, which is no less propagandistic typically than the culture it's trying to inveigh against. But I don't think there's a subtlety in this understanding of reflecting. And the subtlety needs to be there in a time of trouble. It's usually an early casualty of contentiousness. But let me see if I can re-inject it into the thing. So rather than thinking about a mirror, you could imagine that the principal job of the artist in a culture is prismatic and not reflective. Reflective is a little, seems to be, there's not a nuance to it. It's just, here's you. This is what you're like. This is what you're doing. In other words, it's argumentation. So if you're a storyteller, you're no good as an artist if art is supposed to be just, dragging down the mighty. So what's left instead? I said the word prismatic as an alternative. And the way a prism works, everybody remembers this from their high school or public school days. So you have this thing that's allegedly invisible, which we call light. You can't see it directly by trying to train your eye upon it. But they say when this alleged invisible thing passes through this prism, this miracle ensues on the other side. And the miracle is known to you as a spectrum. I'll say it differently, not using physics now or light. So the invisible, the hard to recognize aspects of a culture are, even though they're hard to recognize, they persist and they ensue. And the particular sensitivity of the artist is employed by the culture prismatically, so that the things that the culture has a very difficult time seeing about itself, when those things pass through the artwork proper, not the artist, the work, when it passes through the work, then the culture is more available to itself in its constituent parts than it was before. But here's the thing, the culture is not complemented necessarily by the function, it's revealed by the function. So you'd have to reasonably expect in a time of trouble, in cultural disillusion and destitution like this one, that no culture would welcome the artistic function in its midst, because the poverties would be more manifest as a consequence of the artistic vision and less reassuring than the politicians are, but more trustworthy, I would say, for sure. So it seems to me then, if I marry that understanding to the question, that perhaps what the storyteller's job would be first and foremost is to make sure that the poverties of the time register, appear, are corroborated, and are affirmed in the telling.
I don't know about you guys, but we just had a bit of a freeze. Did everyone experience that? Or was that just me? Oh, that was just me. Wonderful. I missed the end of that, but I'm sure that it blew the circuits on my computer for a good reason. Um, Fairy Ann's coming in with a question, and she is wondering about um, to support the development of humans.
Sorry, I didn't get the question at all.
Okay. Fairy Ann is wondering about new paradigms and old paradigms. And she's studying with different organizations that are really all about new paradigm, teaching cultural rituals. Um, they're teaching about the creating for the villages for children, and she's in this wondering with you about the role of individualism and village life, and she's wondering about how can we create new cultural paradigms to support the development of all humans.
The question is, it's acres wide, but it's asking me about grass. The context is too vast, at least for me. Number one. Number two, as I said in print not that long ago, what am I, Noam Chomsky? Like I'm supposed to know all the answers to all this stuff? You know, all that, I got all the how-tos, and we've all waited until today, and now all shall be revealed. You see what I'm saying? So I mean, nobody sitting in this chair or your chair has the obligation to know what to do. That's one. But two, I'll say it again at the risk of repeating myself. I'm not that interested in the future. That's a terrible thing to say. I don't really mean it that way. I mean, if I've been invested with any capacity, it's not clairvoyance, it's observation. That's my job. My job is not to be a stranger to the strangeness of my times. If I'm preoccupied with the how-tos and, and the fix and the get over it and the next bright, shiny new possibility paradigm-wise, I mean, the first casualty is the present. And I'm a citizen of this trouble, you see. So I'm not keeping anything from you by refusing to answer the question in the terms that it's been asked. I am saying something here. I'm not just rotating on the head of a pin. I'm suggesting to you this. You don't need to follow my example. Of course not. But since you're asking me, that's the obligation I have to you, is to answer as faithfully as I can without being unnecessarily seduced by the magnitude of the question. See? So I would say that if you don't begin your fundamental contemplations with the poverties of the times, then every fix that you imagine, that you dream, that you attach yourself to, that you pay somebody to teach you about, every one of them will be floating in the air, just trying to get over something. The problems that we have, it's unfitting, it seems to me, to be a citizen of an allegedly free country and to try to turn the page on the present, hastily and unseemly. I know the present is not very compelling. I know there's no promise in it to speak of at all. It's not lost on me. And the only alternative I would offer to that would be this. Like you, I was born into a troubled time. There's no question whatsoever that this time is troubled. Often have pushback on this point, if you can believe it, that people will say, well, I don't think it's particularly, people have always had troubles. I didn't say people had troubles. I said it's a troubled time. The times have troubles. My God, the scale of it is hard to think. But it's interesting that it gets personalized in the pushback. But I'm not personalizing. I'm saying this. Like you, I'm a child of a troubled time. Now, I either turn that into an affliction that I'm trying to get out from under, or I turn it into an assignment that bears me in mind and that makes some claim upon me. I think you can tell which one I've chosen. So I'm not seduced by the notion of fixing. I'm not saying nobody else should do it. I'm just saying there's only so much of me to go around, and the notion of the solvents and the solutions and the great grief bypasses that often ensue is not something I would ever give myself to. Now, I should say I'm a farmer. I mean, when I'm not out here in, where am I? What's the name of this place? Denver. When I'm not in places like Denver looking out at the highway, I'm farming. And I mean, it's a God-given thing for me because I get a chance to address everything you're asking me about in terms of how I interact with the place and the climate and the animals and the notorious insects and, all the slings and arrows of the endeavor. So, for what it's worth, and it's not much, there's another aspect of my life where all of this stuff comes to call. And I translate everything you're asking me about into something either I can do or can't be done. I'm trying to grow soil, for example, which is a challenging place where I live. But that's the obligation I have when I said yes. That's part of the vow that I made at the time, which I'm continuing to live out. But I don't come to the farm as a problem to solve. Though God knows there's problems galore in the place, I come to it as something that I signed myself over to. And in that sense, I'm submitting myself to it. And yes, I'm suggesting to you now that you forego some of the instinct for paradigm shift stuff and consider the real possibility that this current regime could use your presence and your labor. And that's the present tense. And I'm not suggesting that you're not doing it at all, but I'm just refocusing the notion of solution, because you've noticed now that's the principal request that I'm getting in these questions, is what to do about, how to fix, how to get on the other side of, and it's not surprising and it's not unusual. And I think I understand in a general way why that would prevail. But it's interesting that that's what we lead with. How to fix what is what I come back to. The fixes have to come from the what, not the other way around.
Thank you. I so appreciate one of the main things I've learned from you over these years is the value of a question
Yes.
and how and the intricacies of how we weave those words actually creates the red carpet to the door that might open to that mystery place of wondering. And I know for me, this is a lifelong endeavor to get to those profound questions that bring us to those doors. And I appreciate you just being with us as we continue to uh, learn that process.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for prompting me on this question of questions. Let me just say another one or two things and then we'll get to the next question. And it'd be this. Questions very often are confessions inadvertent. That is, in the course of formulating the question, you find, maybe despite some of your inclinations, you find where you're really headed, or what really is captivating you, or what's troubling you beyond what you allowed to be. That sort of thing. That's one. Two, as you've suggested here, the great preciousness of a question is that the better questions do not submit to the answers. Because answers are a dime a dozen. They really are. But questions are precious when they're well wrought because they survive encounters with the answers. At the end of the answering, a well-wrought question is still there, shimmering, not a problem to solve and not a gap in your understanding. A question is the rest of your understanding, the part that your daylight mind wouldn't really tolerate.
That explains a lot of my own personal torture of trying to figure out what questions to bring today.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the questions that people are bringing. And I think we probably have one last question. Um, and it's the one that kept nagging at me yesterday. One of the things I remember you speaking to, and of course I'm not going to quote you correctly, but it was one of those things that really landed in me, which was the first third of your life is about cultivating and understanding what your gifts are. Perhaps you'll tell us the way that you say this. The second part of your life is discovering the places and the people who want to receive your gifts. And the third part is the final act. And there's been so much. I so appreciate you're bringing us to the doorway of the final act before we get there, as a way of preparing in this journey to elderhood. And you've been doing this for a long time, this journey to elderhood and preparing culture and people who are ready to do it. And you've even said that you've come to near-death experiences several times. Um, and I really appreciate you saying that near death is not like a near is like a not like a near birth. It's like it's not it, you know. So I just want to honor that in what you've shared. And I'm just curious about what has changed for you or what is evolving. What are you observing in your own experience as you come closer and closer into your own relationship with, um, not your own relationship with eldership, but as you deepen into your relationship with eldership, what is continuing to reveal? Or has anything shifted?
Um, well, I look like this now. That's something that's happened. I didn't used to look like this. So the characterizations you make are, I believe they're showing. You know, I don't examine myself in great detail, but uh, but they are showing for sure. But it's not bad to look your age. You know, it's much less confusing, not just for me, but for people around too. You know, because even though it's an age intolerant, it's a frailty intolerant culture. But I'm fairly persuaded that this is also there. That there's an instinct of a sort in us that draws nigh to something that seems to endure, not something that resists life, something that seems to live. So I'll tell you a little story that comes from, I believe, what you're asking me about here. So I'm a pulmonary refugee, which is to say that my lung predisposition drives me south in the winter, along with the monarch butterflies and the Canada geese. We all meet at the same place and we head south. And so this particular year, I think it was around 2016 maybe, and I'd been working on this book about, well, I didn't know that it was about elderhood exactly. I didn't know what it was about, but I was finding out by doing it. It came, and it turned into come of age. But so I was driven south, and I'm down in Oaxaca, and I don't go out. I mean, you could probably tell. I just I just don't go out much. So I'm not very good at it is the point. And there's a certain skillfulness to being able to do it that I clearly don't have. But somebody obliged me to come to this bar, and so I did, and it was downtown Oaxaca in the days before it's become what it's now. But it still was pretty busy. And I'm in there about 19 seconds, and of course your ears are bleeding, right? Because the music is so loud, and I don't know what the point is of people being somewhere where they can't actually hear each other. So all the cues are visual, right? You can make sound, but there's no nuance. I mean, I should say, you probably know this better than me, but anyway. And so I see this woman looking at me, and she's probably half my age or so. And she says something to me from a great distance away. And, you know, my training, such as it is, in that moment, obliged me to step forward and say to her, sorry, I couldn't hear what you're saying. And she said to me, what do you do? Now, I don't think I've ever been asked that as a straight question. And so I wasn't sure how to answer it. But like a fool, because I'm not experienced in these matters any longer, I thought she was actually asking me that. And so I answered the question in those terms, yelling over this music, you know, which is obviously a foolish thing to do and completely misreading the situation. So, I mean, don't listen to me about anything. if I can't even figure out how this thing works. But anyway, so I'm so I'm telling her what I do, I suppose. And she said, "So you're down here to do that?" I said, "No, I'm doing it while I'm down here." Yeah. She said, "Well, what's the thing you're working on now?" I said, "Oh, it's a book about elderhood." And she literally said it in this voice. She said, "Why?" Like that. I said, "Well, I think something," well, again, like a fool, I thought she was asking me why, not telling me not to do it. It was clearly the second one, but the first one is the one I interacted with. I said, "Well, I think something happened and continues to happen to people on the way from middle age to oldness." I didn't even get the whole sentence out of my mouth, and she just palmed me off like this. And she said, "Oh, I know what happened." So I leaned in because I thought the rest was coming. And she stopped there and she just looked at me. "I know what happened." I said to her, "What?" She said, "That wisdom that you're talking about, that's abandoned people your age completely. We have it now." So the reason I mentioned the story in the context of the answer to your question is I'm sure it's happening. I'm sure it is. That 30-year-olds are volunteering for active duty as ersatz replacement elders. I'm sure that's happening. Equally sure am I that people are going to them as if that's a true thing, as if it's a necessary thing, as if it's the next obvious thing to try now that the old people have failed to come through with the goods. I'm sure all of that's happening. But I'll go out on a limb and suggest the following. There is something about expecting a person in their 30s or 40s to have the capacity of genuine diminished endurance that makes them both liable and listenable or considerable, that nobody in their 30s or 40s can even begin to approximate or resemble or imitate. And that's not a terrible thing to say about people in their 30s and 40s. They're not supposed to be able to do that. They're supposed to be in the land of that we were talking about earlier, the land of culture work principally, not personal work, not inner work, cultural work principally. So the beautiful thing about an elder, it seems to me, is that they've succumbed mightily to the diminishments and blandishments of life, to the point now where what they mostly are is stuff that didn't work out. But there's no bitterness there. See, there's an understanding that there's a value to the culture in manifesting diminishment and not being all you could be and never doing that again, of understanding that people need to learn diminishment too, not being the best damn self they can be, but not being able ever to be the best self you can be, whatever the hell that's supposed to mean. So, P.S. So I like wine, you know. I got some here to get me through this traffic that's outside the window. And as soon as we get off this call, I'm going to it. But it's cold turkey so far. Now, I don't know, I don't understand how wine does what it does, but I know it's alchemy along the same lines as matrimony is. Something magic happens to grape juice. I mean, people can explain it physics-wise and chemistry and all the rest, but I don't care about the explanations. I love the mystery of it. When I drink it, I think, my God, how did that happen? Because there's one thing, that taste and the tannins, but man, the high all by itself is a mystery. And the fact that it's temporary, oh my God. And if you do it the right way, it doesn't hurt you the next day. That's amazing too. Anyhow, that's not the thrust of the story is this. So let's imagine that the best wine begins its life as 500 gallons of grape juice, which after a few sips It's just not getting it done, no? So you put it away, and the people who know how to do this do it. And let's say 2 years or 5 years, whatever the vintage is down the road, man, that stuff is that magic I've been alluding to. And how did it happen? And one of the answers is this: you don't have 500 gallons anymore. No, but neither do you have any grape juice. You got something less, and maybe it's a lot less than 500 gallons to give you the elixir and the alchemy that's in that bottle that you should be on at least one bended knee in front of. Unless you got problems with alcohol. I'm not recommending that, of course. So what am I saying here? I'm saying in order to achieve that deepening that the wine is clearly manifesting, it's diminished in volume to gain something in depth. And if it's true for wine, it's true for people too. And there's something of us that is looking to the diminishment of an older person as the signal feature amongst their real attributes.
Thank you for the alchemy, for the wondering, for the daring to be with us in the ways that we're able to ask questions at this time, and to be so alive in the while you're traveling and in Colorado and highways and air conditioners and God only knows what else. And I just really want to thank you. Thank you so very much for being with us and for doing all that you do to be able to be with us and to carry this with us, and the commitment to keep sharing through your books, through your tour. And I want to talk a little bit about your tour, because you guys, I've seen this. You won't be the same on the other side of it. That's all I can say. And I'm not going to talk too much about it because, Stephen, you just got the big. But there's poetry and there's music, and you're working with this other beautiful woman now, and there's just alchemy. I feel like there's so much alchemy in what you're creating, and presence with being exactly where we are, right on time in this moment. And so he's traveling up and down up the East Coast of the United States for the next month. That link will show you everything in terms of where he's going to be traveling. What you can't see over there, you might be able to, is that in December he's coming to the West Coast, California, and going all up and down California. I'm
Yep.
very happy about. I'm going to make a plug, and Natalie might hate me or love me for this, but I do know that they've been known that if you're nearby and you have a real penchant for bringing this to your hometown and an extraordinary commitment to really produce an event, it's worth reaching out and seeing what other Orphan Wisdom alum are in the area that can support you, and bringing it to your hometown, because it's one of the greatest gifts you can bring to your community right now. And I've had the real privilege of doing it in a couple of cities now, and looking forward to seeing you in California soon enough. And I think this is our moment when we can perhaps take ourselves off mute and bid you goodbye in the way that we can. And you said I would say bless you, but there was such a warning with your word blessing, and so I want to say just give our gratitude, give our great gratitude to you, and to wish you well on the rest of your journeys. May you
Thank
be
you.
well protected.
Thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you, indeed.
Thank
And
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Bravo.
Wow.
Yeah, very rich. Very
Thank you.
rich. In a diminishing way.
Still love it.
Be well, take good care, and we will send a replay out the next day or so.